Good evening, and thank you very much for having me. When we first started, Tim thanked the wonderful folks in the business community here, the great people who run this theater. I think we need to take a moment to remember that a festival like this, if it goes well, is sort of like a nice dinner party. You walk in, everything's set, interesting people, good dinner, everything just show and you leave. The fact is, it takes an awful lot of hard work to put these things together, and let's take a moment to acknowledge the tremendous hard work and continuing work of the people who work for McMinimans who have made this possible for us. As Tim said, the topic of my talk tonight is the so-called Rendelshok Forest incident, alternately known as the Bentwaters incident or the Bentwaters Woodbridge incident. To say that this is an important case is an understatement. Outside of this country, it is seen as one of the very most significant incidents in the history of UFO study. I think here, a little bit less so because it didn't happen here. We're kind of funny like that. The fact of the matter, though, is it involves citizens of this country in a very profound way. The incident occurred in and around two of the most highly secured NATO facilities in the United Kingdom, RAF Woodbridge, RAF Bentwaters, both in Suffolk, East Anglia, a very rural, very beautiful area, about 70 miles northeast of London. In late December of 1980, a series of events occurred over 3 nights in Suffolk between Christmas and New Year's that were so profound in their implications that had the real nature of what had occurred in those forests, that field, in and around those 2 bases ever been made public, it would have changed profoundly the relationship that then existed between the United States and Great Britain, as well as the way we see ourselves in the universe. Obviously, that didn't happen, which is pretty much always the case. But it did change the way that people in Great Britain, in Europe, and beyond see the UFO story and the level of seriousness that it is now taken with in Great Britain. A little bit of the backstory first. As Tim had said, I began my research when I was 3 years old. I'm 28 now. Thank you. And after 10 or 11 years, I was seriously looking for a project that I could sink my teeth into for a book. I was aspiring as a writer. I'd had some articles published. I had a lot of dreams of making a mark in this field, as some of you may have. And in 1987, the summer of 1987, the 40th anniversary of the incidents that kicked this off, I attended a conference in Washington, D.C., sponsored by MUFON, where I was a panelist on a discussion about the abduction phenomena, basically rooted in my work with Bud Hopkins and some of his colleagues. And there was a speaker there who interested me tremendously. His name was Larry Warren. And I knew who he was because he had become a kind of public figure in the field in 1983, at first under a pseudonym and then under his own name shortly after, as somebody who alleged that he was not just an eyewitness to the most astounding part of these 3 days and 3 nights of events, but that he was the whistleblower, who was the individual who had gotten this information public. And it's funny, I remember sitting in that hall in American University, listening him talk, saying to myself, either this guy is one of the most courageous people I've ever met, or he's one of the most reckless and naive people I have ever met. Larry's not naive, but he is headstrong, he is heroic, and he took some risks that one person in 1,000 would. When we say the term whistleblower, some of us think of somebody like Karen Silkwood, who, in trying to expose the tremendous abuses in Kerr-McGee, the corporation that was basically radioactively poisoning a number of its employees, and Karen died in a quote-unquote mysterious car accident on her way to an interview with a New York Times reporter, we usually think of that level of the game. Whistleblowers are not like us, and I say it after studying them as a kind of particular character type. They actually believe that the world should work properly, that people should keep their word, that people should be treated with respect, and that institutions should safeguard the rights of the individuals that serve them. Larry was a young volunteer at the time, a 19-year-old in the United States Air Force stationed in England, with specialty training in anti-terrorist activity, as well as working around nuclear ordnance. Now, by the time he had finished speaking, I knew I wanted to speak to this guy privately, whether or not this was the root of a book or that it would be a heck of an interview. We chatted the next day in the hall, and I was taken aback at how quickly he agreed to the interview. In fact, he was at my apartment in Manhattan the very next weekend, and that recorder ran for about 5 or 6 hours. He let me ask him any questions I wanted, gave me permission to use any of the material that he had put on that tape without any kind of payment, and put some things on the record that he had not talked about in the public forum the week before. By Sunday evening, I was a little wary. Why had he laid all this information out for me? And he said, frankly, I heard you on that panel discussion, and I know you're not terribly well known in the field. I know you've never written a book, but I think you're the guy that I want to write a book with. My terms are these. As long as I get to say what happened to me, what I saw, what happened to me as a result of what I saw, and discuss some of the other incidents I've had in my life that are non-standard, to put it mildly, you are not only free to pursue any research you wish to support my claims, you are free to disprove me. I am going to turn over every bit of paperwork I have, whether it's my high school report card, all my military records that I possess, most of which I do not possess, and which are now classified. Here is the phone number of my mother. My life is an open book to you. It did not strike me as the claim of somebody who was lying or exaggerating their involvement in an incident to go on the record like that. It would have been a pretty schizophrenic book if I had proved him to not be telling the truth, and he's spending half the book saying that this happened to me, and I'm spending the other half of the book saying this didn't happen to him, and here's why. But I did, and I have to tell you here, I had no idea of what I was getting into. None at all. In my mind, I thought, well, here's something we can devote a year, maybe a year and a half or two to. We should probably go back to England. That'd be a good idea, make us look more serious as researchers as well. And we'll get the book published. It'll be a bestseller. We'll sell it for a movie. George Clooney will play me, and I'll be famous and have millions of girlfriends, and life will go on. Well, life doesn't always work out as it does in our dreams. What was going to be a year to 2 years, one trip to England and a couple of $1,000s, became 9 years. Between the two of us, 15 trips to England at our own expense, bankruptcy for both of us, and ultimately a bestseller that changed the way that people think about this subject all over the United Kingdom. And for that, I am eternally proud. We're going to look at some slides, and if we have a chance, we're going to look at some video footage. The book itself looks like this. It's a big fat 500-page book. If you have a pet cat, do not drop this on the cat. It will hurt it very badly. It reads in some places like fiction, but I have to tell you, my name and reputation is attached to it. Everything is fully documented, and most of the things in several respects. It opens and closes like a legal brief, because you are the judge and jury on this incident. Many people have already passed on it as a case that would, if such things were brought to court of law, be the case that could crack this wide open. Let's face it, the seminal UFO incident case legend in the world is Roswell. I don't think there's a case more important. However, we're dealing with an incident that is more than 50 years past, and as Stan Friedman says, we're kind of racing the undertaker here. Most of the individuals involved, directly or indirectly, have already passed on or certainly advancing age. These events I'm going to describe to you took place in 1980. Literally all of the principals are involved. If, and it won't happen under this administration, we were to have another and properly conducted congressional investigation of the UFO question, many of the witnesses who are named in this book could be subpoenaed and would testify. Also, Tim had mentioned when he first brought me up here that I'm here courtesy of the Sci-Fi Channel. What does Sci-Fi have to do with UFO reality? The Sci-Fi Channel is a media company. Their sister companies is the USA Network and Universal Studios, and they are going through a bit of a change right now. Somewhere along the line, they decided that maybe they should do some programming for that funny bit, the group of subjects that sci-fi is based on, because the fi is often rooted in reality. And I'm proud to say that as of 6 weeks ago, the network was given the go-ahead to produce a feature-length 2-hour documentary on the Rendelshok Forest Bentwaters incidents that will be aired this October. And partly as a result of that, they were kind enough to sponsor me to be here with you in truly one of my favorite states in the Union. And I'm very happy to be back in Oregon. So, to the slides, Randy. How about one of mine? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I've had, pardon? Yes, if you would. Let's dim the front lights. Okay, Larry Warren is a guy who was born in New York City. A very fine family as far as I'm concerned. I've met many of his relatives. His mom is one of my favorite people in the world. Catholic background, raised with the right values, joined the service for the right reasons and because there was a chance to go to England where he had done a year in his high school schooling. He loved England. He's also a big Beatle fan and knew that he could get cheaper tickets to the Who by being stationed in England than in the States. At the time, you could actually still request your country of posting. He was, I think, the very last individual before they changed the policy. And this is a picture of Larry in Texas in basic training in the summer of 1980. Next, please, Randy. Okay, to set the location, this is a pretty much a basic grid map of England. You've got the top of Scotland. We'll cut off there, but we don't really need it. Okay. That big blue dot gives you an idea of the area where this happened, and that covers Suffolk, East Anglia. Reminds me, though, that when we first did this talk after this book came out, our first venue was Gulf Breeze, Florida, and it was very exciting to actually do a talk with a book for the first time. And after it was over, a very nice gentleman came over to Larry and asked, very respectfully, Mr. Warren, that big blue dot there on the map that you showed? He said, yeah. He said, the UFO was that big? It was not that big. Next, please. Okay, closing in on a bit, you see the twin base complexes of RAF Woodbridge, RAF Bentwaters, about 6 miles in from the English Channel right here. And again, we're about 70 miles northeast of London, as this map indicates. Next, please. And yet another one. This really brings us into where the action is. At the very top here, you see RAF Bentwaters with its main runway, its classified runways. We actually saw an SR-71 Blackbird that you guys now have to keep the Spruce Goose Company. When they were still classified at high performance conditions, it was the most remarkable terrestrial thing I have ever seen in the air, and was probably over the coast of New York about 40 minutes later. Now, the area that's penciled in green here is the Rendelsham Forest. One thinks of England, one thinks of history, mythology, all kinds of wonderful, mysterious stuff, fabulous forests filled with who knows what. This is not one of those romantic old 8th century forests. This is a forest that's about 100 years old that was created purely for logging purposes, but is a good thick forest and actually separates the twin bases by about 5 miles. Now, RAF Woodbridge here has the longest runway in all of Europe or the United Kingdom. And both bases are now decommissioned, although RAF Woodbridge still has a minor function, as I recall, in air-sea rescue and in recovery, emergency recovery for our space program. At the time of these incidences, these were two of the most highly secured and well-manned bases in the entire NATO establishment. And in late December 1980, the incidents that created the stir were set against a rather dramatic backdrop. Number one, if you were to go back to your newspapers of December 1980, toward the end of the month, the biggest international story involved a renegade Polish shipyard electrician working in the Gdansk shipyards in Poland and organizing an increasingly successful pro-democracy movement in a hardcore communist country, and that was Mr. Lech Walesa, who went on to become the first president of Poland. Now, what we were not aware of in the United States, because our newspapers did not tell us this, and probably for the right reasons, was that something like 120,000 crack Soviet tank and infantry troops were massed along the Polish border and ready to roll into Poland. If they did, World War III would have begun. Every single NATO base in Europe, every single NATO base in the United Kingdom was on a full red alert. Red is one step below black, and black is war. The other tiny complication is that at this time, it was transition in terms of American leadership. Ronald Reagan had been elected president the month before. Carter was still president, but we're right in that sort of lame duck period. Now, according to our treaties with Great Britain, nuclear ordnance was permitted for the Americans to bring in 1982 under an agreement between Ronald Reagan and Dame Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister. Up until then, it was not permitted. However, in violation of our treaty with the United Kingdom, we have established that at the time of the UFO events, something like 350,000 kilotons of tactical nuclear devices were stored in underground bunkers, hardened bunkers, made of alternating layers of concrete, steel, and earth. A 1 kiloton nuclear device has a kill zone of 10 miles. If you were to put a compass point down on a map and spin it 10 miles, the first mile of that circle, the bullseye of the target, would be glass. And the next 10 miles, there would be no living thing. So, when the British government came forward after the so-called Rendelshok Forest incidents to a spokesperson for the Ministry of Defense and said, "We are not sure. We do not know what happened in those woods over that course of those 3 nights around the elite bases that we leased to the Americans. However, we are comfortable with the fact that they were of no defense significance." It's a tremendous untruth. Even if this were some kind of conventional intervention over secured airspace where nuclear devices were stored, when you're dealing with 350,000 kilotons of nuclear devices, this is indeed of defense significance. So, we're talking about 3 nights of activities, the first 2 nights of which my co-author, Larry Warren, was on leave. He was in London with friends. And when he returned that 3rd morning, it was not like this was being whispered from guy to guy that they were making flying saucer jokes or that it was a rumor sweeping the base. He didn't know anything about it, and that included when he went on guard mount, where these men who are posted around our military bases are checked out to make sure that they are in proper form and have not ingested even any cold medication or even had a beer 24 hours before they are posted online on a base perimeter with a loaded M16 or other ordnance. Well, again, this is Forest, here's RAF Woodbridge, here's RAF Bentwaters. The main incident on the 3rd night, the one that Larry was involved in, and we'll get back to that shortly, occurred right about here on this red dot in a farmer's field that I know like backyard I grew up in now. called Capel Green. Very pastoral, very pretty. By the way, all of the forest is considered Forestry Service land and open to the public. Many people walk their dogs there. It's not uncommon now to walk into the forest and see people who are there as tourists because of the Bentwaters incident, the Rendelshok Forest incident. Next slide, please. Right. This is one of the legendary warning signs to not cross a perimeter in Ministry of Defense held facilities. And I took it with a great deal of respect right up until the moment that I slipped under one and wondered if we were in an area with a lot of landmines. It's funny the stuff you do when you get obsessed with the subject. The base at this point had been decommissioned, although it was still heavily guarded. And we were caught and thrown off the base more than once. You know, at a certain point, you just become extremely committed to projects, and you're not thinking about your safety the way you normally would. Next slide, please. Okay, had you visited the base in 1988, this would have been the sign that welcomed you to the base. We've got the NATO symbol there. It was Donald F. Klein, who was colonel and commander. The 81st CAT Fighter Wing, this was their home. They have since been disbanded, and their units and materials dispersed to other military bases around the world. Next, please. This photograph, had I taken it a few short years earlier, I'd probably be getting out of a British security prison right about now. It was taken with an extreme telephoto lens, and it is a hardened bunker in which some of this nuclear ordnance was stored. Next, please. This is also part of the WSA, that is Nuclear Weapons Storage Area. And on the first night of events, which would have been the night of, I guess, the 26th, 27th, UFOs came in over this weapons storage area and hovered and moved off. Now imagine if a Piper Cub off course or a civilian helicopter came in over a military nuclear weapons storage area and refused to, or was unable to, or chose not to identify itself when questioned. It would be vaporized. They would shoot first and do paperwork later and get sponges and pick up what was left of human beings. We do not know for a fact whether or not these unknowns were fired upon, but they moved over the area with impunity, multiply witnessed. Next, please. One more view of the weapons storage area. Okay, Larry, it's funny the way things work out in life. He had just gotten a small Kodak Instamatic when he was on leave on those 2 days before. And one of the first pictures was the entryway gatehouse to the main entrance to the base. And you will see here quite clearly there is a sign that says alert condition. That has nothing to do with UFOs, although it is ironic. It has to do with the full red alert and the fact that literally every single fighter aircraft, including all the A-10 tank busters, which most of us first heard about, the first Gulf War incursion, and also served more recently in the Iraqi conflict, all of their aircraft were already at forward operating locations in West Germany, ready to move if war became imminent. Next, please. Right. This is the very extreme end of the major runway at RAF Bentwaters. And by the way, these fences have now, these fences were fairly new in 1988 at the time. They were like a little bitty cyclone fence that you could have almost jumped over. Security has changed quite a bit. And again, this is way pre-9/11, but American bases licensed from the British were still targets for IRA terrorists. And on this particular night, with the alert condition, every single guard post was manned, which is non-standard. Larry was posted to perimeter post 18, which is actually this little rise here, which is an old World War II pillbox. If you've ever had the pleasure of traveling in Great Britain along its eastern coast, there are thousands of these old little structures that were 1- and 2-man defense units that were built in the very dark days of 1940, anticipating an invasion from the Germans. And Larry had been posted. He has a Motorola radio. He has an M16. And he's beginning to hear some chatter over the radio of guys saying, you know, there's one overhead. UFOs were indeed being seen down the line. He could not see any from where he was, but the chatter was shut up very quickly by more senior personnel who came on the radio and told the guys to knock it off. Shortly after, he was informed that a base vehicle would be along to pick him up and that he should close down his perimeter post. There was another assignment. Next slide, please. About 20 minutes later, this pickup truck, military version, or one exactly like it, driven by a lieutenant, well, I think it was Lieutenant Bruce England was either driving or in it. Also in it was Sergeant Adrian Bastinza, a key player in this story as well, and happened to be the gentleman standing right next to Larry Warren in that field a short time later when they had the experience of their lives. The vehicles were brought to the base motor pool where trailer hitches, they were hooked up to their trailer hitches. Many of the vehicles were then hooked up to light-alls, which are essentially the civilian equivalent of those big Hollywood Klieg lights we associate with movie premieres. These ones are gasoline operated, all of them were topped off. The vehicles were then moved to the entranceway to the base, and sometime after midnight, they rolled out into the British countryside. Now, it was a night again in December. There was no moon, it was tempered, and once they were off base, there was very little ambient light. This is pretty extreme countryside, not unlike areas not far from where we are here. Next slide, please. That is the now decommissioned main entrance to RAF Bentwaters, where the vehicles came out of. Now, although you can't compare this to the type of treaty violation of having all the nuclear ordnance there in violation of our treaty with Great Britain, as the men rolled through that entrance, another treaty violation occurred. They were now carrying live loaded weapons with high-power ammunition on English soil as opposed to their base. That is not okay. Next slide. This is the guard post for RAF Woodbridge, the sister base. And it's at the end of a road that runs about half a mile called East Gate Road, because this is the gate. Now, the name of our book, Left at East Gate, is kind of a conjunction of the fact that as the men, when they were coming toward the sister base, there was an MP in the road who stopped them. Right in front of them was a small white Ford Cortina, which is a Ford that is actually manufactured in the car was a young mother and a sleeping child. The men were close enough in their pickup truck to hear the woman ask what the problem was, and the MP told her there is unexploded ordnance ahead, we're removing it. Now, to be told that there's unexploded ordnance, i.e. an unexploded bomb, in the road somewhere ahead, normally is kind of a stretch. It's a little bit hard to believe. But study your history and go back to the Battle of Britain, which raged for weeks over Suffolk, dogfights between the great RAF fighters and the very formidable German fighters, and they are still pulling unexploded ordnance out of those woods 60 years later. So this is not a joke in this area. After a little while, the car moved on. They pulled up to the MP, asked where they should be going, and what he told them was, in so many words, a left after Eastgate Road onto a logging road. And that's just what they did. And they headed up that logging road. Next, please. Okay, this is that logging road. And they went about half a mile down, a couple of 100 yards down, where there's a rough-hewn circle. And this is a road that indeed is created for logging. Vehicles move in and out primarily to remove timber. It's also a very popular place for dog walking and bird watching. Next slide, please. Okay, at about this point where you see the broken tree, there is a widening, a circular widening right here. And this is where the vehicles pulled in, stopped, cut their engines, and the men disembarked. almost immediately, or as part of this caravan of vehicles, was a similar truck to a regular pickup truck with racks welded on the back. It was an armorer's truck, and the armorer collected the weaponry the men brought out there. The men, who were primarily American Air Force security police officers, highly trained individuals, dedicated to their work, most of them quite young, as is often the case in the military, were broken up into unarmed, three-man groups. Each group was given a Motorola radio. They were told to head that way into the woods toward what seemed to be a glow in the distance to investigate a disturbance. And into the twilight zone they walked. It is now well past midnight. They're trying to bring the light-alls out. Absolutely none of the light-alls will kick in. Motorola radios are fritzing out. Flashlights are working erratically. And as the men moved into the woods toward this glow, which was actually coming from the field, beyond the woods, the static electricity charge in the air was so intense. Let's remember here that we've got a lot of 18 to 20-year-old guys with very thick, healthy head of hair. Don't we wish we still had that, guys? And this was a unit that wore berets, not helmets. The static electricity charge was so powerful, it was pushing the berets off the men's heads. Think about that for a moment. As they walked in, Larry heard a distinct sound of a man breaking down. And he and his team came upon another one of their team who was basically curled up with his back to a tree stump, crying, being calmed and comforted by another personnel. They moved on. Their light that they were seeing grew stronger, and at a certain point, the trees cleared and they could see the farmer's field ahead, which we know is called Capel Green. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an important picture for several reasons. I have been to this field now, I would have to say 100, 150 times over the last 15 years. But this was the first moment that I saw it as we cleared the rise, and this is the very first picture I took. Now, one of my methods of research was record everything and sort it out later. If I have sort of a guiding spirit in terms of the way that I do my work, it is the wonderful deductive reasoning that I was introduced to at 12 years old when I started to read Arthur Conan Doyle and became enamored with Sherlock Holmes. According to deductive reasoning, you start with the most mundane explanations for the mystery you're facing and examine them one at a time. And whatever you're left with, no matter how extraordinary, is probably fairly close to the truth of the matter. Now, at this moment, I have recorder in hand. We cross the rise. I'm very aware that Larry Warren has not been back to this field in 8 years and 3 months since the night of the incident. It wasn't even like he went back the next week to check it out. This was not a happy place for him. And as we come over this rise, and follow me here, I'm recording this, Larry's arm shoots out, literally reflexively, and he points over here. Can we get a little more focus on this? I don't know if we can, but maybe just a bit. And he says it sat right there. And then you're listening to this recording, which is one of the many transcriptions that is captured in the book. And he says something to the effect of, but of course, that's just a coincidence that that area where it sat all those years ago is darker and sort of oval-shaped, but definitely discolored from the rest of the field. Now, my first reaction was not, oh my God, look at that mark where a flying saucer sat. It was, yeah, right. What's the big deal? It could be a play of light. It could be a lightning strike from 4 years ago. It could be that the farmer who owned the field dumped a load of nitrite fertilizer on that spot and had not graded it out. I started with the most mundane, and we spent several hours on location. And over that time, it's an overcast afternoon, what a shock for England, just like here. We're looking, and you're squinting your eyes, you're walking along the edge of the field, and at a certain point, son of a gun, that is different. And I had a couple rolls of black and white film, although I went on to shoot many, many, many dozens of color rolls over the years. And I had, those little empty plastic film canisters you get there for 35mm film. And I hiked myself out, 100 feet or so, into the center of this ellipse. And notice where it is in terms of this rise of trees, because that's going to be important in the next photo. And I go to about here, what for me is about dead center, and I scoop up some of the soil. Then I walk several hundred feet out into the field toward the farmer's cottage, and I scoop up some more soil. And I know I'm digressing here, I'm jumping back and forth between the incident. Our time is going to go very fast in any case, and I'm only going to be touching on this, so I want to make it as broad-based as possible. And when I did an analysis of the soil, a very informal one, there was no question about the fact that the soil looked different, felt different, reconstituted with water differently, and what was confirmed several years later through professional soil analysis was quite dramatic and quite shocking to me. But back to the night of the incident. They get out to this point. They see over to the left, the lights on the second floor of this farmer's cottage are on. They're up. They seem to be watching. Now, sitting on this spot is a ground fog. Well, if you've ever seen a kind of moody British movie from the 40s or something, you know that fog is a way of life in England. However, this ground fog was circular. It was self-illuminated and about a foot or two off the ground. It was literally like a giant aspirin tablet, very clearly defined, and the men were ordered to surround it in the same procedure that they would use to secure a nuclear device, a procedure called covered wagon. And they hold their ground. Now, after X amount of time, 20 minutes, half hour, I forget, they all begin to observe, and there are dozens of personnel out in this field now, dozens. And they begin to observe coming in from the direction of the North Sea, i.e. the English Channel, only about 6 miles away, a reddish glowing shape that's not moving much faster than a balloon in the wind, but is obviously under intelligent control and is not a balloon in the wind. And the object comes in closer and closer and closer. And it comes in literally directly above this spot, maybe 30 feet, 40 feet up. All eyes are on it, understandably, and without a sound, it explodes with such magnesium brightness that it was the equivalent of many, many flashlights, flashbulbs going off at once for the men. It was more than that, though. It actually burned the retinas of Larry Warren's eyes. We have Air Force medical documentation in Left and Escape to back it up. It obviously did the same thing to other men. And left everybody blinded for a moment or two. We all know the feeling after having somebody take a snapshot of us and, within several seconds our eyes readjust. When their eyes readjusted, sitting in the ground fog, either floating in it or on some kind of, apparatus, was a machine of undetermined origin. There was nothing ethereal or gossamer-like or speculative about this. It was metal. They could actually see metal fittings. It had a very unusual refraction. I've heard it described as like mother of pearl. It kept shifting. It played games in a way with sort of colors. It was hard to look at it directly as opposed to try to see it with your peripheral vision. It also played what I can only call some very strange games with the shadows of the men who surrounded it. If they would move, and bear in mind here, you've probably got some men, no matter how highly trained, in some degree of physiological shock, as probably any of us we would be in a similar situation. Now, when a man moved, they would observe their shadow to move, but slightly after the fact. There was kind of a thickness in the air, and in fact, when this thing appeared, a number of the men ran off into the woods. Almost all of them held their ground, though, because they're highly trained, and they just did. Now, at this point, they are all in a full circle around this machine. And what is weirder than the shadows playing tricks on the surface of it is the fact that there's no lights behind it. None of the light alls worked. There was no moon. There were shadows, but there was nothing to create them. I am just reporting what I have researched here. There's a lot of non-standard material going on this evening for these individuals. Well, they hold their ground, and after a prolonged period of time, 20 minutes or half an hour, Larry and Adrian, and next slide please. Larry and Adrian observe, and I'm sure other men as well, focus a bit, that there is a light that they see on the far side of this thing. And this is a sketch that Larry had done for me in November of 1987, 3 months before we left, trying to give me an idea of what the overview was. He said, I can't really draw the shape. It was like a circle and an arrowhead, and I'm not an artist, but I think he did a great rendition. As you can see, even this basic sketch does not depict a craft shape that we are familiar with from the world of popular fiction. These marks that we see indicated with pencil here, each one pretty much stands for an individual airman standing in cordon around. Larry and Adrian would have been standing right about here. And there were cameras on location. This was not only filmed, it was filmed with video, which was new technology at the time, and you couldn't miss those big bulky cameras. It was filmed with 16mm movie cameras. It was filmed with 35mm film. The Air Force now acknowledges that there was some film shot, but it was all fog and it doesn't exist. Right, and I don't either. Failed light-alls were over here, and the glow that they saw started about here and started to move around this way. Finally, it passed this appendage and came into their line of sight. Now, they are close. They are like 20 feet from this glow. Shock is funny stuff. We've all had the experience, unfortunately, of receiving that profoundly sad phone call that a loved one has just died very suddenly, or we've been in an auto accident, or something has happened to give us that adrenaline dump, an epinephrine dump, tunnel vision, auditory exclusion. Body goes into a very specific series of incidents during shock, and sometimes the way it's manifested is in some kind of intellectual denial. And Larry and Adrian watched very carefully as the glow receded, and they were able to make out 3 distinct shapes within the glow. And as the shapes became clearer, Larry's reaction was essentially, oh my God, what are kids doing out here? This is a military situation. Within 2 or 3 seconds, there was no question in his mind, there were no children on location. There were 3 beings. They were not your stereotypical grays. In fact, they seem a bit more stocky. They were about 4 feet tall each. Arms, legs, torso, enlarged cranial structure, and those huge, dark eyes that we have had described so often over the years. And just to make it a little better, they all seem to be in single-piece fitted garments. They were semi-translucent, and they're floating about a foot off the ground. Every single man is unarmed. Can you imagine what might have happened? Everybody remembers the day the Earth stood still and poor Platoon gets off his saucer and takes out the device to give to the President of the United States and catches one. There is some anecdotal evidence to suggest, and I don't know what to say about it except to just lay it out for you and hope that you read the details in the book, that the Air Force may have had an idea of what they were sending these men into to confront, which in itself is extremely disturbing. Next slide, please. Just a bit of a close-up of the overview of this craft. Next, please. Okay, we're going to jump ahead here, but not... Actually, Randy, can we go back one? I love analog technology, thank you. Okay, the men are standing their ground, and the night is going on. It's now 2 or so in the morning, and Sergeant Ball, the senior master sergeant on location, is moving around the... Oh, take that back. Again, in a case like this, one tries to remember all the details that one can in the about appointed amount of time. After the beings appeared, one of the ranking base officers, who we are as sure as we can be, was the wing commander, Gordon Williams, steps through the cordon of men, also unarmed, and stops facing about 10 feet away from these beings. He is a tall guy, 6'2" or so. He cocks his head slightly down. These 3 beings do this. And that was it. Part of the mythology, the nonsense, the spin, The goofy, unsubstantiated rumors that surround this case is that overt communication took place here. Handshakes were done, candy bars were exchanged, etc., and so forth. This is patent nonsense. However, let's face it, scientific studies indicate that more than 70% of all human communication is nonverbal. Body language, a gesture, eyes, words are secondary in many cases. And the fact is, a human being looking in the eyes of three non-human beings in a field in England may be constituted as some sort of communication. In any case, the standoff continued into the night. And it was not long after this that Master Sergeant Ball began to move around the perimeter and tap every third man and discreetly order them back to the staging area. Again, that's almost half a mile or so, a couple hundred yards from where this has happened. Larry was in the second to last group to be tapped out, dutifully headed back to where the forest meets the woods, headed back to the logging road, but stopped at that perimeter where the forest met the field, looked back to fix the picture in his mind. Here's the officer, here's the beings, here's the craft, and went back to the vehicle. I can't believe how little time I have left. I really have to apologize. It's just a very difficult case to sum up, but let me move quickly. On the way back to the base, the men started to ask each other what they thought it was. They were admonished absolutely not to discuss this with anyone, even among themselves. They would be debriefed the following day, and indeed they were. However, Larry, being very close to his mom and a very independent guy, the next morning called his mother in upstate New York and began to tell her about this incident. Was cut off on the phone, had Greg Batcher with him, another airman who witnessed this. His mom had a witness at home who spoke with her as well. And he was very quickly called on the carpet, told he had violated this order. At the same time, we know you guys were pretty stressed out last night, so we're not going to throw the book at you, but you've got a choice of dropping a rank or taking a modest fine. He chose the fine, knowing that it would take him years to get his airman first class status back, possibly, and left the service not having fully paid it off. Was contacted some years later by the Air Force Office of Finance about that $96-odd that he owed them, and said, I'll be happy to send you that check if you just remind me what that was about. They didn't. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Air Force Form 490. It's a fancy name for an appointment form for medical appointment. Larry's eyes began to hurt him from shortly after leaving that field and stayed that way. The next day he requested a checkup. The checkup came in early February. You notice right here, the checkup is February 2nd. It is the Lincoln Heath, which is the sister base also, Eye and Ear Clinic. And what is established here is that he has suffered optical, retina burn exposure. That's the only place it could have happened. And the burns were severe enough that he might not have even been able to be gotten into the Air Force had he had those when he had his physical some months earlier. Next slide, please. Larry wrote to his mom. She wrote back. And I'm glad he was a pack rat and saved every darn thing he had, because this is dated March 22nd, 3 days after the so-called, about a week after the so-called halt memo, a description of the events kind of collapsed together, written by the deputy base commander, who was also a witness. And in the letter, we see Larry's mom saying, just a few short weeks after, well, enough about that. You certainly explained your situation with the UFO, and as you know, Larry, what was seen by you and others, and by others and yourself, was just that, a UFO. It must have been quite... Next slide, please. This is an article from the Venerable Times of London explaining that the sightings that had occurred shortly before were probably the result of a meteor shower, and there was a meteor shower that night. And the fact is, had you been standing in Capel Green looking just the right direction, you would have seen it for about 3 seconds. And that was not what these men saw. Nor was it the Orford Lighthouse several miles away. They end this thing in the most perfectly cavalier manner that is often used to dismiss these delusions that we human beings are subject to, and chalk the thing off to the fact that the film Airport 1975 was shown on television on Thursday night, raising public awareness to the possibility of aircraft trouble. So, rest easy, America. Next slide, please. The men involved, shortly after, were spread out all over the world. Some of them permanently, some of them temporarily. Operation Bright Star, which is now an annual exercise that the American military participates in Egypt, had its very first year then. And this is a picture Larry took of Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, again the man who stood next to him in the field that night in the Valley of the Kings outside of Cairo. Next, please. This is Airman Warren on the day of Wing Commander Gordon Williams' change of command ceremony, at which he was Williams' driver and part of his security team. Years ago, Larry gave me that badge that he's wearing there, told me I earned it, I agreed I had. And when I see him again, I'm giving it back. He's got a 2-year-old son now, and that being a dad has been the best thing that's ever happened to him, and that's a boy that should grow up knowing what an amazing guy his dad is. Next slide, please. There's the sucker right there. Next, please. Focus. This is the rough form for Larry's honorable discharge request. What is non-standard about this is the signature, which on the formal version, of course, was signed rather than rubber stamped, is it signed by the Wing Commander Gordon Williams, again, who we maintain is a witness to this incident, and who has been very, very coy about his involvement. He has come forward and he has said publicly that he will neither deny nor confirm his involvement, which is a long way from a denial. What is being said here is the reason for his discharge is breach of contract. He went into the service to be a police officer. Once this event happened, he was identified as a troublemaker for calling his mother, for caught going through records, for asking guys what they thought had happened, and he realized he might be in danger and should probably get out of the Air Force. He sued for an honorable discharge, received it, and a wing commander only deals with flight activities. It should have been signed by the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles I. Hall, also an eyewitness, but it was not. Next, please. This is Larry's honorable discharge. I've had people actually come up to me and say, you know, he wasn't even in the service. Well, you don't get these out of Cracker Jack copies. Now, you'll notice here that there is something covered. I am not trying to repress facts from you. He's just so touchy about my showing his social security number. Go figure. Next slide, please. Larry moved back to upstate New York. The economy there absolutely sucked. He ended up washing dishes, living with his mom, starting to experience symptoms of post-traumatic distress disorder from not having made his peace with this incident by a long shot. Did not dislike being in the Air Force, disliked what the Air Force had done and how they had treated him and the other men, including one of his buddies who committed suicide shortly after this, by blowing his brains out on guard after manifesting problems that should have pulled him into counseling, or certainly should never have put a loaded weapon in his hands again. And so Larry went back to his original recruiter in Albany, New York. The guy said, shouldn't be a problem, you have honorable discharge, goes to bring him up on the computer. The computer essentially says, no information available, nothing else follows, do not process. He said, what happened to you in England? Larry said, you wouldn't believe me if I told me. The staff sergeant said, I'm going to continue working on this. Died 6 weeks later in a car accident. I'm not saying it was connected, but he's gone. Ultimately, Larry approached his congressman, who is still the congressman for that district, Jerry Solomon, who petitioned the Air Force to get Larry re-enlisted, received this letter from the Office of the Surgeon General of the Air Force that says, among other things, this is a reply to your letter, authorities in the office advised that Mr. Warren was permanently disqualified by the USAF Training Command Surgeon on September 17th. What the heck is that about? He got out of the Air Force on May 15th. And the reason is congenital, partial, ankylosis, radiolinear, joint proximal, bilateral, cannot fully extend right arm. But he cannot fully extend his right arm bilaterally, which means right arm and left arm, and it's congenital, so it's from birth, and he would have never gotten in the Air Force if he couldn't extend his arm. This is bullshit, and this is the kind of crap that they sometimes use to try to throw people off, discourage them from looking into things. And as Larry said, I fully extended my right arm and threw this into the trash. Thank goodness he pulled it out. Next slide. Larry ultimately was connected up with a police officer in Coventry, Connecticut. He was living in Connecticut at the time. And for those of you that are fairly adept students of study of UFOs, you probably know the name Larry Fossen. He's a police lieutenant, now retired, lives in Florida, but was an active investigator at the time. He introduced Larry to CAUSE, Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, and they took the information Larry gave them about the location, the times, the individuals involved, put it together in a Freedom of Information Act, and that act alone resulted in the release of the most profoundly disturbing and sensational document yet to be associated with this case, a one-page report written by the then Deputy Base Commander, who retired about 12 years later as a full colonel. Next slide, please. That photo of that newspaper headline is the result of the fact that once they received that document, they sent it to a number of researchers in England who had requested it as a courtesy, who turned around and sold it to the News of the World, the largest tabloid in the world, for £15,000, kept the money for themselves, and the story broke. Larry is named in the front page article, as is Colonel Hall, and his document, as is Williams. Within weeks, there were something like 120, 130 articles on the subject in every newspaper in England, and the story had broken. This is Larry back on location for the first time in 8 years and 3 months, reliving the incident for me into the tape recorder, and I must tell you it is a profoundly moving recording. I am at 8 o'clock right now. We have a couple extra minutes to sum up. Thank you. Next slide, please. This is once again the same spot in the field, and it's a close-up, but you don't have to, squint too much to see that it is discolored. I can guarantee you it is not an illusion. Next slide. Picture you just saw was taken in February 1988. This photograph was taken in June of 90, 2 years, 3 or 4 months later. This is the exact same spot. It is now bright green. All the grass around it has gone to hay. The reason? We found out in our soil analysis. Number one, in seed germination tests, plants grew much slower in the affected soil and mutated. So that, this is a perfect example, by the time it had finally become green, the rest of the field had moved along by weeks. Also, there was something like 4 times plus the amount of iron particles, nothing near the case that Eric had reported earlier about the concentration of particles. But what our analyst said was that a source of electromagnetic energy sat on that spot and was powerful enough, visualize how powerful it would have to be to pull those little particles of metallic substance through the soil, packed farm soil, into that area. Most interesting was the fact that there is a certain component of sand in most farm soil, and 6 miles from a major coast, of course, it's going to be fairly pronounced. The sand in the samples was just what they would have expected. The sand that the soil that I drew from the affected area, the sand was no longer sand. Our soil analyst, who works for a very respected laboratory in Massachusetts, described it as in an interim form of glass. It had melted down. Now, when you do this kind of casework, you look to triangulate. We have documentation. We have photographic evidence. We have physical evidence. We have anecdotal evidence of witnesses saying this is the spot. And as they say in Oklahoma sometimes, if it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, and it tastes like a duck when you cook it, it might be a duck. Next slide, please. One more shot, again, just to show you that I'm not trying to frame this out and that there are lots of other green ellipses in the field. There it is again. 9.5 years after the incident, I should add. Next, please. and get one more photo in position again to give you a sweep of the field and show you that that's the way it is. Next, please. Handsome devil, yeah? Next one, please. The Rendelshok Forest, a wonderfully evocative and spooky place. I have only just touched upon this story, and primarily around one night, in a book that sweeps across several decades and focuses not on aliens, ETs, are we alone, what planets do they come from, why are they here, but what the forces that be, working groups within our own military community, aspects of our own intelligence community will do to individuals who dare to bring embarrassment to us. Now, again, I've only touched on this. I will be here certainly till tomorrow night. I invite you to ask any questions you want. We don't have a lot of books, but my friend Randy Harrigan has a supply of them, as well as CD-ROMs of the book for you, which I'll be glad to sign or inscribe. Sorry I've run over. I thank you so much for being a good audience, and I hope you'll join me tomorrow morning for the abduction workshop at 9 o'clock.
I joined the Ministry of Defence pretty much straight from school in 1985, and the philosophy at the time was that they give you 2 or 3 years in a particular post and then they move you on. The idea was that you would do, say, a tour of duty in policy, a tour of duty in finance, one in contracts, one in personnel, and they would try to encourage people to have a fairly broad base, then maybe specialise later in their career. So I'd done 2 or 3 different jobs, and then in 1990, after the Saddam Hussein invasion of Kuwait, I was seconded from Secretariat Air Staff, where I was doing a job where the duties included briefings for senior personnel visiting Air Force bases. I had some responsibilities to do with military aircraft accidents, but I was seconded out of that and into the Joint Operations Centre. I was working in a part of that called the Air Force Operations Room, dealing with real-time operational information to do with the build-up to, and then in 1991, the Gulf War itself, the first Gulf War. Yeah. Effectively, I was a briefer. I would get information. It would be to do with the RAF, so it would be bombing raids, any casualties or losses, battle damage assessment, etc., etc. And the key thing was the daily briefs for ministers and the service chiefs. And my job was to take raw data and to transform, as it were, yes, to craft it into something succinct, accurate, that quickly gave those senior decision makers the information that they needed. While I was doing that job, certainly I think in the early part of 1991, the person that I was most directly working to said, look, I understand that before you were pulled out of your old job and seconded down here, you had expressed an interest in moving on from your old job. He said, I may have a job coming up after the war, and that job was the UFO job. Right. So he said, would you be interested, because we had a fairly good working relationship, he said, would you be interested in taking that job up? I think part of me felt that I had actually been looking for a move, so there was, at a certain extent, I was saying, I wanted to move anyway. Yeah. Uh-huh. To another part of me thought, the UFO job? What on earth is that all about? And I think I was so intrigued that we even had a UFO job, that for a number of reasons, and I probably now can't put my finger on the exact decision-making process, but to cut a long story short, I said yes. The offer did actually materialise, and then in the summer of 1991, I actually started work on the UFO project. I didn't really have a detailed picture of what working on the UFO project would involve. I knew that the bread and butter of that part of the job was effectively to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon, and the Ministry of Defence's party line, as it were, was that these things are investigated so that we can come to a judgment on whether any of the UFO sightings might suggest anything of any defence significance, any, for example, a potential threat to the defence of the UK. But I didn't know much more than the standard policy, and that I would be investigating UFOs. I didn't know really the methodology of an investigation. I didn't know what sorts of cases I would come across. I certainly didn't know any of the history of the British government's involvement in this subject. Obviously I'd gone for a chat about the job, but it's not until you actually start and that you have the traditional, and back then it was a 1 week handover where you actually sit alongside the previous incumbent and effectively shadow him for a week and then take over the following week. It wasn't until I was actually doing that, sitting at the desk, going through some of the old files, taking some calls, that I really began to get a flavour of what was involved. In a sense, that's good. I didn't really have any preconceived beliefs on the subject. I certainly had very little knowledge. I'd possibly come across Charles Berlitz's book on the Bermuda Triangle when I was a kid, which from recollection had a chapter on UFOs, but I was certainly not a buff or believer or whatever. Neither was I a complete hardened skeptic, thinking this is complete nonsense. So I went in there, in a sense, with an open mind, but frankly not expecting to find, shall we say, little green men. So that was my mindset. Of course UFOs exist. I mean, because in its literal sense a UFO is simply an unidentified flying object, and therefore, because people do see UFOs, there is a UFO phenomenon, whatever one thinks lies behind it. And I'm sure we'll get onto that. So UFOs are seen and reported in their tens of thousands, and that's an undeniable fact. And some of the witnesses, as we'll discuss, include pilots, military officers, police, etc., etc. I think the question is, perhaps, does having a UFO project imply a belief, say, in something exotic, even extraterrestrial? But the answer I like to give about this, if you'll forgive a little soundbite, is that there isn't a corporate belief in Martians, but there is a corporate belief in Russians. Now, it's interesting that the UFO phenomenon, obviously people have seen strange things in the sky throughout recorded human history, and I'm sure through unrecorded human history as well. The MOD's UFO project has its roots in something that happened in 1950, and I think it's interesting just for me to explain this, because I think it gives you the mindset behind why the MOD, and really why all governments that have dabbled in this subject, are involved. The then chief scientific advisor, the great radar scientist Sir Henry Tizard, Winston Churchill, after the war, had brought him back into government, and he was chief scientific advisor at the MOD, and he said that UFO reports were obviously being received from all around the world, and were obviously in the UK as well. He said we ought not dismiss these reports without some form of proper scientific study. And that was about as far as his statement went, but it probably gives you the quickest and easiest answer into why governments and the military look at these things. We don't know what they are, but rather than just guessing or dismissing, common sense dictates, particularly if the reports suggest structured craft with speeds and manoeuvres going ahead of anything we've got, at least we should be taking a look at that. And that's what Sir Henry Tizard said, and indeed that's why, as a result of his initiative, the MOD set up something called the Flying Saucer Working Party.
Always a great
That's,
title.
it's absolutely,
Yeah.
it's the most marvellously named committee in the history of the civil service, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And we've had a few odd ones. Interestingly, its conclusions were fairly sceptical and reflect, to a fairly large extent, the government's position on the subject to this day.
Yeah.
In other words, we believe most of these things can be explained as misidentifications of known objects or phenomena, as hoaxes or as psychological delusions of some sort. And we've seen no evidence to suggest that there's anything that makes the UFO subject worthy of any further study. We recommend a discontinuation of this research and investigation effort. The plug was pulled a matter of months later. The RAF found itself in the centre of a series of fairly high-profile sightings where UFOs were being tracked on radar, being seen by pilots when their aircraft were scrambled to try and intercept these things.
Yeah.
And the MOD was dragged, I think a little bit reluctantly, some would say kicking and screaming, back into the UFO subject, and has pretty much, until fairly recently, had a UFO project of one way, shape or form to the present day, with the brief being fairly constant: research and investigate the phenomenon, see if there's evidence of a threat.
Yeah, defence significance is ultimately where it boils down.
Exactly. Is there anything of any defence significance? And I think the sceptics within the MOD, and it's important to say that this whole sceptic versus believer debate has taken place as much at the MOD and in government as it has anywhere else, whether it's media, whether it's UFO researchers or anything. But the sceptical MOD line would be UFOs are of, quote, no defence significance. But again, there are plenty of senior politicians and military personnel who say, no, we believe that the UFO phenomenon is of extreme defence significance. I'll have to choose my words carefully, and of course not yet too far into any operational business. But I think you can take it as a matter of public record that UFOs have been tracked on radar on numerous occasions, and there are plenty of documents at the National Archives, both in Britain, in America, and indeed I'm sure in all sorts of other countries, recording cases where precisely that has happened. UFOs have been tracked on radar. Yes, if the radar operators, the fighter controllers, then assess that radar return as being solid, and if it's not obviously using a transponder, so we can't actually identify it as an aircraft, yes, a judgment call will be made, and that judgment call may be scramble the aircraft, be they the ones kept on quick reaction alert, or be they any other fighter interceptors, and go and take a look. It happened very famously, for example, in Belgium in 1989, and particularly in 1990 on March 30th and 31st, when the Belgians tracked a UFO on radar. 2 F-16 fighters were scrambled. They attempted to lock on to the UFO with their airborne radars, which they succeeded in doing. So the UFO was being simultaneously tracked by ground-based radars belonging to both the Belgian Air Force and indeed some radars which were integrated into the NATO network. and indeed, as I say, by the pilots themselves on their separate airborne radar. Every time they achieve lock-on, the UFO seemed to break the lock and be capable of evading the aircraft. They tried to and succeeded in reacquiring on a number of occasions, and this game, as it were, of cat and mouse played itself out in the Belgian skies for some considerable time. Observers on the ground, including a number of police, said that they could actually see and hear the aircraft, they could see the UFO, they could see this unfolding, and they said every time the aircraft looked as if they were getting close, the UFO seemed to be capable of moving away at great speeds. That's a fairly famous case, but there are many other cases, a lot of them in the 50s, where perhaps the Cold War and people's nervousness about Soviet aircraft probing our defences was at its height. But plenty of cases on the public record. A number of pilots have spoken out quite publicly about being involved in these intercepts. So yes, these things do happen. I've spoken to civil pilots who've seen these sorts of things. Graham Shepherd was an interesting example, a senior British Airways captain who'd had 2 spectacular UFO sightings in 1967, which was of course a big year for UFO sightings all around the world, but particularly in America and Britain. I've spoken to military pilots who were involved in intercepts. I've spoken, interestingly, to military pilots who've seen UFOs who never reported it. And again, perhaps I'm sure we'll talk a little about numbers of reports and such like. But these things go on. One of my most interesting conversations was actually with somebody at the RAF, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning Centre at RAF Fylingdales, and he said, from time to time, he said, we see meteorites and fireballs on our space tracking radar. He said, they do speeds of about 17,000 miles an hour. And I said, simple question, I said, how do you know they're meteorites and fireballs? And he said, well, because they go very fast. So there was a sort of, well, what else could there be tone of voice? But that's interesting, because it goes to the heart of something which I feel quite strongly about. What's equally important in looking at the UFO phenomenon and the way in which the military respond to it, it's not just the equipment, i.e. your radar systems, be they space tracking radars or be they more conventional air traffic control or military radars. It's actually the training and the mindset of the people operating this. It's well known, and I can't go into obviously too much detail, but it's well known that, for example, you can use filter programs on radar to filter out anything that goes faster than a certain speed, lower than a certain speed, because all the time your radars are configured for what you're expecting to see, what you're actually looking for. Anything that doesn't conform can be filtered out by a computer program now, but the important thing is there's also a filter program up here. And I think people's minds sometimes say, well, that's interesting, I got an anomalous return on my radar system, but then it just faded away. Well, people know radar it's not an exact science. You can get a false return because of temperature inversion. A flock of birds in some circumstances will give you a return, the flock dissipates, the return disappears. But it's all too easy, I think, for your belief system to kick in, and if it doesn't behave like a conventional aircraft, the filter program in your mind can filter it out. I wonder sometimes how many interesting UFO cases have been lost because of that mindset. Now, I'll do a boring statistical bit, but I'll give you, I'll make the point for a reason. Doing my job at the MOD, I got about 200 or 300 UFO reports each year. Now, of course, that was just in the UK. My brief was just national, not global. I wasn't, of course, the only person getting UFO reports. Some people would report to the local media. Some people would report to one of the civilian UFO groups. Well, the police or the military, we did have a national reporting system.
Yeah.
Anyone who reported a UFO to a police station, to a military base, or to a civil airport, there was a standing operating procedure whereby those details should be recorded and the cases should be sent to the MOD for investigation. Now, having said that, it was clear to me that system was operating in a fairly patchy way. It needed beefing up. Some people had clearly lost the standard operating procedure, and I've spoken to some police forces who said, oh, we just treat these as hoax calls or crank calls. And I said, no, there's a procedure. You're supposed to record these and forward them to us. But the point is, there was a national reporting system. But as I say, some UFO reports go to the media, some go to the UFO groups. Most people won't actually report at all. Two reasons: fear of ridicule and simply not understanding where to actually make a report. Who you're going to call. So you could figure that my 200 or 300 reports were obviously just the tip of the iceberg. And I've seen this for myself at even at UFO conferences where you know that you're drawing in enthusiasts and people who've got a natural interest. I've seen it done with a show of hands. How many people in the audience, speakers will ask, have seen a UFO? Then the follow-up question is, how many of you made an official report, or indeed made a report to anyone? Those people, keep your hands up. Everyone else who didn't report it, put your hands down. Most of the hands go down. We only study a very small part of the potentially available data. But here's the interesting thing: that happens as much with the military as anyone else, even though the military should and frankly do know full well that there is a standard operating procedure and that they're mandated to make a report. I've spoken to pilots who said to me, look, Nick, he said, I've seen UFOs, and some pretty interesting sightings. One of them said to me on the course, he said, look, I saw a UFO, it casually overtook my aircraft, it wasn't a light, it was a craft. Obviously can't go into huge details about prototype aircraft, but he was fairly sure it wasn't anything, not one of ours. But he said, I didn't report it, and I said, why not? He made a little joke of, he said, I didn't want to be known as Flying Saucer Fred for the rest of my Air Force career. Now, if that mindset is prevalent in the military, when they know about the process of making official reports, how many other spectacular reports are there out there, both involving pilots, radar operators, or members of the public, that we just sadly never got to hear about at all? A lot, I would suggest. This particular one caught my eye. As you say, a flight of Tornado RAF jets had been casually overtaken by a UFO, which they described as a sort of delta or diamond-shaped craft with an unusual configuration of lights on it. There was some speculation that it was a stealth aircraft or some such object, but there was, for some reason or the other, and it's not really appropriate to speculate, there didn't seem to be much follow-up of the incident. So the MOD's file contains little other than the report from the pilots themselves. But knowing what we now know about the speed of a stealth and the configuration of lights, that explanation doesn't seem to fit. Some people have proposed that a potential satellite re-entry might explain the UFO sighting as well. But again, space junk re-enters the Earth's atmosphere a lot of the time, and I've spoken to a lot of scientists about this, and what you get is a sort of high altitude firework display. You don't get what these RAF pilots reported a solid structured craft actually coming from behind the aircraft, in front of the aircraft, and then accelerating away. So that didn't seem to fit either. Intriguingly, the date of the UFO sighting was 5th of November, so some people said, well, maybe it was a big firework for our Godfork celebrations, but that was obviously just a joke. No, this is just one of a number of cases involving military witnesses where, to this day, there is no satisfactory explanation for what's seen. It's a shame that there wasn't more follow-up, but I think the UFO Project's files, and I'm sure the files indeed of Project Blue Book, are littered with intriguing cases like that, which perhaps weren't followed up as much as they should have been. Halfway through my tour of duty in March of 1993, there was a major wave of UFO sightings over the United Kingdom, and indeed over other parts of Europe. I came into work on the 31st of March, and the phone was ringing. I picked it up. It was a police officer down in Devon. He explained to me how he and his colleague had seen a UFO. So of course I took the details of the report and began to investigate. Pretty much as soon as I'd started that, the phone rang again. Another UFO report came in. Again, another police officer. The reports came in thick and fast throughout the day, and indeed over the next few days. And it was soon clear that this was a major wave of UFO sightings. That because quite a lot of the sightings had happened at night, a lot of the witnesses were police officers on night patrol. Now, of course, there's no such thing as an infallible witness, but inevitably trained observers such as police officers, military personnel, pilots who will have an idea of what things look like in the sky, speeds, heights, distances. Inevitably, some witnesses are better than others. So it was interesting that there was a high proportion of police officers reporting this to me. The earliest UFO report came from, it was 30th of March 1993, and it was about 8:30 in the evening. That was from funnily enough, an off-duty police officer who was actually leading a troop of scouts out on outside activity. And he saw an object which he described as almost being like two Concorde aircraft stuck together. So a pretty massive craft. The interesting thing in all of this, it goes back to an interesting point about the under-reporting of UFOs. Sometimes when people say how many UFOs how many reports do you have for that night, you might have one piece of paper on your desk that you treat as an individual report, but at the bottom there'd be a throwaway line, as for example there was with one of the police reports, and it said, I know from monitoring my radio that dozens of police colleagues throughout Devon and Cornwall saw the same thing. And interestingly, again, with this scout group, again, we didn't have individual reports from all the boys. So the number of people who'd actually seen this thing over a course of several hours, the last report was at about 2:40 in the morning on the 31st. So this UFO, whatever it was, had been operating over the UK for a period of several hours. The number of witnesses clearly ran into hundreds, but of course again, UFOs are majorly underreported. Now, the critically interesting point to me about this case, and it was something of a turning point. I think sometimes it's been said this is the case that turned me from skeptic to believer. I think that's an oversimplification, but it was certainly a case that had a profound effect on me and made me hopefully more open-minded to some of the more exotic possibilities. The UFO flew over two military bases, RAF Cosford and RAF Shawbury. It was seen by a patrol of Air Force police officers at the first base, and then it was seen by the meteorological officer at the second base. Now this was a man with 8 years experience in the Air Force. As a Met officer, his job was looking into the sky. He was based at an Air Force station. He saw aircraft and helicopters on a frequent basis. So this is probably about as good an observer as you can get in terms of not the sort of person to misidentify. He described to me a vast triangular shaped UFO moving slowly over the fields coming towards the base. He said there was a narrow beam of light firing from the craft. That beam of light was tracking from side to side, he said, as if the UFO was looking for something. He said there was a low frequency humming sound coming from the UFO, and he said it was one of those unpleasant sounds that you could feel in your chest as well as hear. He likened it to standing in front of a bass speaker, that sort of effect. And as he was describing this to me when I interviewed him, he was clearly quite shaken up by this, and he said that this was unlike anything he'd ever seen before, and quite what I could tell this chap. And incidentally, he said that the UFO had been moving fairly slowly, 20 or 30 miles an hour, and then suddenly had shot away to the horizon, many times faster than a fast jet, and that's a consistent description from many witnesses in some of the most compelling of UFO cases, but here it was being relayed to me firsthand by an Air Force witness. What was I supposed to say to him? Sorry, it was just a weather balloon. So yeah, of course I launched a full investigation. We checked all the usual sorts of activities that give rise to misidentifications. We, at any given time, have an idea of what's flying in our airspace. We look at flight paths. We look at the radar data. Of course, I ordered the tapes being pounded and sent to me at Ministry of Defence headquarters. We looked at those radar tapes. I worked with some specialist radar staffs in the Air Force. We looked at the data. There were some inconclusive readings that might have explained, or rather might have corroborated some of the sightings, but radar is an inexact science. The particular radar head is one that was prone to picking up ground clutter, as I said, tall buildings under certain meteorological conditions. So the honest answer was, yes, there is something on the radar, but whether it's the UFO and we've tracked it or not, there's nothing you could really take to the bank. This went up the chain of command through my head of division to the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, one of Britain's most senior military officers. He said, as often happened with the most interesting UFO cases, this was almost the catch-22. Because we'd done such a detailed investigation, the reply was, well, this is extremely interesting, but there is really nothing else that we can do by way of taking this forward, but noted with interest, object unexplained, case closed. Or rather, I say case closed, in effect, case like an unsolved murder perhaps, forever open but effectively unresolved. Whether we'll get what the police would call a cold case review, and whether we'll go back and reopen investigations, as I did from time to time with other cases, I don't know. One interesting postscript to this story is that I recently was heavily involved with and presented a programme on British network television on one of the prime channels, devoting an hour to an investigative documentary about this case. Following the broadcast of that programme, I received personally another 25 reports from witnesses who had seen this UFO, either on the night concerned or at some stage before and since, seen this same sort of vast triangular shaped craft, and had never previously come forward or reported to anyone. So there perhaps is some further work we can do. Whether we'll ever explain that case or not, I don't know. As ever, skeptics have tried to perhaps shoehorn one or two things into it. There was a re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere of a Russian rocket that night, but that occurred at a very precise time and would have given a sort of high altitude fireworks display. And even the director of an observatory here in the UK has actually said he doesn't think, although he's sceptical about UFOs, he doesn't think, from what he knows about this case, that could explain it. Or if it did, it could only explain a handful of the high altitude sightings, but many of the witnesses saw a vast triangular shaped metallic craft at low altitude. One of Britain's most compelling UFO cases, without doubt.
I feel warm, strong, numb. I feel warm, strong, numb. Way too high up there to feel your hands reaching out for me. Invincible, no need to shift back. My body floating down below me, far from where my mind is at. Did I close my eyes or did the lights go out? I feel warm, strong, numb.
Yes, I mean, to me, Rendelsham was always the most important case in the history of the British government's UFO project, and indeed I reopened the investigation into it to try and do, again, what a police officer would call a cold case review, to try and see, did we miss anything this time round? Is there new evidence that we can find on this? And yeah, it's a critically important case because it involved military witnesses, and it wasn't just a one-off, it happened over a series of nights. It's interesting, there's an interesting piece of psychology, as it were, that when people try, as they sometimes do, to downplay this sighting, they refer to the fact that the official report is titled Unexplained Lights. When you actually read the official report that is entitled Unexplained Lights, it makes it fully clear that what we're dealing with was a landed metallic craft, and on the first night lights in the forest were seen. The patrol thought that maybe one of the aircraft from the two bases involved, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, twin bases under a unified command separated by Rendelshok Forest. They thought one of the aircraft had come down. They went out to investigate. They saw this landed metallic craft moving through the trees, touching down, flying off. One of the military personnel got close enough to touch the side of the thing. They sketched, or one of them sketched, strange symbols on the side of this craft, on its hull, which he likened to Egyptian hieroglyphs. They do claim that they took photos of it as well, but that they were told, some of the United States Air Force witnesses, that oh sorry, there was nothing on the film, it was just fog. Obviously a lot of conspiracy theories have grown up as a result of that. The UFO came back on a subsequent night. This was December 1980. The deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel, or Lieutenant Colonel as they say in the States, Charles Holt, had heard about these UFO sightings. He was at a function and the door burst open and a young airman ran up to him and said, "Sir, it's back." And Holt looked a bit confused and he said for a moment, What's back? He said, "The UFO, sir, the UFO's back." So Holt threw together a team of people, he took some powerful generators, light generators called light-alls, into the forest with him, and he took also a personal dictaphone on which he recorded his thoughts and observations as he and his team effectively tracked the UFO. And the interesting thing is, his words were that he went out to debunk this. In other words, he thought it was all stuff and nonsense, but he couldn't debunk the thing because he ended up becoming a witness to it as well. And I've heard the tape. You can hear the tension and fear even in their voices as the UFO approaches. At one stage it's firing beams of light down at the military establishment. Again, clearly, whatever you think UFOs are, this has got to be of defence significance, it seems to me. And again, a hugely important part of the story of the Rendelsham incident is that when the landing site from the first night's activity was examined, they found 3 indentations in the ground where this thing had landed, perhaps on legs, and those indentations, when they were mapped, formed a triangle, so as if this thing had come down on a tripod-like device. And most interestingly of all, when they looked at the area and they ran a Geiger counter over it, they found that the radiation readings they recorded were significantly higher than background. And that quote comes from a Ministry of Defence assessment done by the Defence Intelligence Staff. And surprise, surprise, they peaked those radiation readings in those 3 indentations where the UFO had briefly landed. So all sorts of interesting things. There are still many unanswered questions about the Rendelsham Forest incident. Many things, frankly, were mishandled. The initial investigation was not done as I would have carried it out. So far as I can tell, no cordon was established around the landing site to prevent cross-contamination. No detailed search with metal detectors was undertaken. No soil samples were taken. So in many ways this was a mishandled investigation. An intriguing unanswered question is the removal of certain items of evidence. We don't know what they are. It might be the photos, it might be other things that are not recorded in the files. But the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Air Force in Europe, General Gabriel, made an unscheduled visit, so far as we know, to Bentwaters Woodbridge after the event, immediate aftermath of the event, and recovered certain items, returned them to his headquarters in Ramstein, Germany. Now, the file on this, the Ministry of Defence file, makes very interesting reading because it says somewhat plaintively, maybe we could have a look at these items too. But again, there seemed to be no follow-up. So the trail, I won't say it's gone cold, because I know that a lot of people are aggressively using the Freedom of Information Act both in America and in Britain. My view now is that I can't rule out an extraterrestrial explanation for some UFO sites. My view is that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is a possible explanation for that, particularly when you look at craft which in terms of their speeds and manoeuvres go way beyond anything that we've got, including black projects. I can't rule out an extraterrestrial explanation for that. My view is that there is some intriguing evidence that would support such a hypothesis, but that there's no hard proof that could actually put the matter beyond debate. with both UFO sightings and indeed with the alien abduction phenomenon, one could say that in a small number of cases, and I want to make that very clear, it's only a small number of cases, psychosis could I think be both the cause of the experience and indeed the result of it in different circumstances. It is unquestionable that there are some people whose mental illness will cause, say, delusions, and that with some mentally ill people they will fixate on the UFO or abduction phenomenon and they will see or describe their experiences or such like in that way. But none of this is meant to disparage the phenomenon. I think one could say that people with psychoses like that will fixate on all sorts of different things. Often it's religion. So it doesn't come as any surprise that some people with psychoses would drift into the field of ufology. I think the flip side of that is almost more interesting. Could some sort of psychosis be the result of an experience, whatever that experience might be? And I think unquestionably the answer has to be yes. The obvious consequence, and I've seen it with some people, is clearly post-traumatic stress disorder, which, whether somebody has had what believers might call a genuine encounter with, say, extraterrestrials, or whether the person simply believes that they have, perhaps because they've misidentified something, it's quite possible that that person could be profoundly affected by their experience, and the consequences of that might be post-traumatic stress disorder. It might actually go further and become some form of more serious psychological or psychiatric condition.
Recognizing you, recognizing you.
Yes, certainly the theory that quote psychological delusions unquote might explain a number of these reports has been around for decades, and indeed the Ministry of Defence was seizing on that as a potential explanation for some of the UFO reports, certainly as early as 1951. Having said that, it's interesting. Yes, I mean, inevitably there will be a handful of people with psychological, psychiatric conditions, fantasists, whatever, who attach themselves to the UFO subject, who come to UFO researchers or to the media with stories that have no basis in anything other than perhaps some form of delusion. But it's interesting, particularly in relation to the abduction phenomenon. There have been a couple of scientific studies done on this in America by Susan Clancy and Richard McNally, and two that I want to mention briefly, but they're very important. The first one was really, and there have been 2 or 3 experiments in this, one of which was actually run in the UK by Professor Chris French. There have been attempts to look at a look at a group of abductees, and in a double-blind experiment to compare and contrast those abductees with a control group of non-abductees. Now, the first, I'll call this set of experiments because this has been done both in America and Britain, certainly suggest no evidence of any psychopathology in any of the abductees, and that's important in these double-blind experiments. So, if you'll forgive me for using an unscientific word, but these people are not mad. None of that necessarily means that the experience is real in the sense that some people might use that word, but certainly it tends to suggest that the abductees, or at least the ones that have been tested, really aren't suffering from any sort of psychological condition. The other experiment was equally interesting, and what was done was that, again, in double-blind conditions, the group of abductees were asked to relay their experiences. A control group of non-abductees was asked to relay very similar experiences as if it had happened to them, and imagine themselves suffering the trauma of it, both physical and psychological. Now, interestingly, these people were being monitored, and in the group of abductees and not the control group, they found physiological responses such as more rapid heart rate, increased perspiration from the abductees. Again, none of this proves that the experiences happened in a real physical sense, but it did suggest that these people weren't lying and that they genuinely believed that these experiences had happened. Belief is hugely important. Now, I don't think a belief can of itself generate an experience, certainly not the sorts of physical experiences where we've got UFOs tracked on radar or other physical trace evidence where a UFO has landed, where it's been photographed or such like. But belief is important in my opinion, not so much as the stimulus for an experience, but in the way in which we interpret experiences. Inevitably, I think, how we perceive something, that goes not just to UFOs and abduction experiences, but of course much wider. It really covers many things in our ordinary everyday lives. Belief, your beliefs, your knowledge and your cultural background will play a part in how you perceive and interpret experiences. I think the example that I can give in relation to this is that imagine a scenario where somebody wakes suddenly and sees a shadowy figure at the foot of their bed. Now, if that person is particularly religious, they might perceive that experience. They might come to believe that what they've seen is an angel or a manifestation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. If that person was a ghost hunter, they might be thinking in terms of spirits. If that person was a ufologist or had a knowledge of ufology, inevitably they might look at this in terms of aliens and alien abductions. Now, an interesting theory to follow that point up is, what if these experiences, whatever they are a little bit more amorphous than we might suspect? What if there is a phenomenon, but it is neither extraterrestrial nor religious nor any of these other explanations? It is amorphous, but it collapses into something more tangible when it interacts with the witness. In other words, it sort of takes something from the witness's knowledge and culture and belief system and is then perceived and defined in that way. And there's an interesting parallel with quantum physics, and I suppose the whole interaction between an event and the observer actually affecting the experiment itself. And I often wonder whether both UFOs, alien abductions, and perhaps all manner of other strange phenomena might be explained in a way more akin to quantum physics. Well, I've often been asked about the Men in Black, and on one occasion I remember being asked, and the audience there was a sort of murmur and then outright laughter, and I realised that in the middle of a denial of this, I was stood up wearing a black suit, and indeed, of course, I'm wearing a black jacket now. But I think undoubtedly there have been occasions, of course, where government and military personnel have gone to visit UFO witnesses as part of the normal investigative process. We don't tend to do it now, but it certainly happened in the past. And particularly during the days of the Cold War, I think it's quite possible that a conversation was ended with a phrase such as, probably best not to talk about that. For I think fairly understandable reasons, more to do with just being a sign of the times. Just the default position back in the days of the Cold War was not to discuss anything to do with the government and the military and intelligence. I think there's a world of difference between that and suggesting that there's some sort of agency going around silencing UFO witnesses and researchers. I mean, actually, if there were, they're an extraordinary inept agency, because of course there are sort of TV programs, DVDs, radio shows, absolutely. So I don't hold much for that theory. I think there are potentially another couple of points worth mentioning. It's quite possible to me, it's well known that in the UFO research community, many of the individual researchers and groups hate each other and are in competition with each other. So it's quite possible that somebody perhaps gets a whiff of an interesting case and then goes and visits the witness and thinks, well, I'll pretend to be from the government and I might get some more information. It's possible that we're dealing with Walter Mitty type fantasists. It's well known and documented that there are people who dress up as police officers, as paramedics, and actually go to the lengths to get the correct uniforms, vehicles, etc. as part of a sort of fantasy. It's probably quite glamorous to portray yourself, if you're going to have that sort of Walter Mitty fantasy, as part of a sinister government conspiracy and group of people in charge of the truth about extraterrestrials and UFOs. It's also possible that some of the people who claim to have been visited by sinister men in black are simply not being truthful when they make those claims. So again, I don't think there's one neat answer. There may be a lot of different things going on, but despite the way I'm dressed, I'm not some sort of real man in black.
We just asked the question which leads on from that, which is what a lot of people want to know.
Yes, indeed.
You are wearing black, you've left the MOD, or are you a stooge? No, it's a simple question.
It is,
sure.
And he wants to answer it.
Yeah, I want to answer it, yes. Because it is a question.
You've got to tell people.
It's all over the internet, so yeah, sure. Well, ever since I spoke out publicly about the UFO phenomenon, I've been accused by certain UFO researchers and conspiracy theorists of being a disinformation agent, being part of the cover-up, but being somehow put out as the friendly face, designed to encourage UFO groups to send their reports to the government, designed to mislead people and plant false stories, etc., etc. Those stories first surfaced as soon as I spoke out. They haven't just started now I've left the MOD. In a sense, let me do what of course I can only do, deny them. It's simply not true. I'm not a disinformation agent, but I won't say much more than that because frankly there's no point. The sorts of people that believe I am are probably so wedded to the idea of a cover-up and a conspiracy that nothing I say is going to change their mind. I'm not going to deny it and then have them turn around and say, oh, all right then.
Because he's denying it.
The denial with those sorts of people is simply seen as reinforcement of their own belief system, so perhaps it says more about them than it says about me. But let me clarify why I did leave the MOD. I left simply because, having done 21 years working for the government, I just felt that it was time to move on I've got a number of outside business interests, and I just wanted to spend more time pursuing those business interests. I didn't leave because I had got too close to the truth. I wasn't forced out. I'm still very friendly with all sorts of former colleagues. I get invited back on a regular basis. Of course, some people say, "Oh, he hasn't really left at all. He's just sort of pretending that he has, but he's really still on the payroll, and he's still gathering information, planting disinformation, etc., etc." No, I left. I had a tremendous time. I very much enjoyed my 21 years of government service. I've done some fascinating things, not just the UFO project, all sorts of other things, but it was simply time for something else, fresh challenges.
Have you ever met Scully and Mulder?
I've never met. You mean the actors?
The actors.
I've never met David Duchovny or Gillian Anderson. I would particularly like to meet Gillian Anderson, and I have several occasions expressed a desire to work with her on various projects. And no, I think, actually, joking aside, it would be a good in-joke, and honestly I haven't got any ulterior motive for that whatsoever.